There comes a moment in life when an empath stops explaining, stops chasing closure, and stops trying to make others understand the depth of their pain. Most people think empaths are weak because they are kind, patient, and endlessly forgiving. But what many fail to realize is that an empath carries an emotional memory that never truly forgets how they were treated. They can endure disappointment longer than most people. They can stay silent while their heart breaks, and they can continue giving love even after being wounded again and again. But once the damage reaches a certain point, something inside them changes forever. An empath does not disappear loudly. They do not always argue, seek revenge, or announce their departure with dramatic words. Their exit is often quiet, almost invisible at first. The messages become shorter, the energy becomes distant, the warmth slowly fades. And by the time people notice the absence, the empath has already emotionally detached beyond repair. What makes this so powerful is that empaths usually leave only after they have exhausted every possible chance to save the connection. They stay longer than they should. They forgive more than they should. They hope longer than they should. So when they finally walk away, it is rarely impulsive. It is the result of countless hidden disappointments that were ignored for too long. The truth is, an empath's silence can say more than anger ever could. When they stop reacting, stop defending themselves, and stop asking for understanding, it often means they have accepted a painful reality. They realize their compassion has been taken for granted. They understand that their loyalty was mistaken for weakness. And in that realization, they begin reclaiming their peace. What looks like distance on the outside is often deep emotional survival on the inside. Because once an empath reaches the point where protecting their soul matters more than preserving the relationship, they become impossible to pull back. Many people underestimate the emotional depth of an empath because empaths rarely expose the full weight of what they carry. They absorb tension, feel unspoken emotions, and notice the smallest changes in energy. They can sense dishonesty behind smiles and coldness behind affectionate words, yet they continue giving chances because they believe people can change. But every broken promise leaves a scar. Every manipulation drains a part of their spirit. And eventually, the empath who once gave endless understanding becomes emotionally unreachable. Tonight, we are going to uncover the painful truth about what truly causes an empath to disappear forever, why their silence is often the final warning people never recognize, and the deep psychological shift that happens when someone who once loved with their whole heart finally decides they can no longer stay. An empath rarely leaves at the first sign of pain. That is one of the biggest misunderstandings people have about them. Most individuals assume that because empaths are emotionally sensitive, they are also emotionally fragile. But sensitivity is not fragility. In many cases, empaths can endure emotional pain far longer than others because they constantly try to understand the reasons behind people's behavior. They search for explanations instead of conclusions. They look for wounds behind harsh words, stress behind cold actions, and fear behind emotional distance. This ability to see deeper into human emotions is what keeps them staying long after most people would have walked away. An empath is often the person who forgives quietly while carrying invisible emotional scars. They are the ones who continue checking on others even when nobody checks on them. They listen when others need support, absorb emotional tension in silence, and try to create peace in relationships even when they are the ones hurting the most. But over time, this emotional labor becomes exhausting. Every ignored feeling, every dismissive comment, every broken promise slowly builds emotional fatigue inside them. The dangerous part is that most people never notice this process happening because empaths do not always express their pain openly. Instead of confronting people immediately, empaths tend to internalize emotions. They replay conversations in their minds. They question themselves before questioning others. They wonder if they are overreacting. They try to be understanding. They convince themselves that people are going through difficult phases. They continue giving second chances because they believe everyone deserves compassion. This is why many toxic relationships survive longer with empaths than with anyone else. The empath keeps hoping the connection can heal if they love harder, communicate softer, or remain patient a little longer. But emotional endurance has limits, even for the most compassionate people. Every time an empath feels unheard, something inside them slowly weakens. Every time their kindness is exploited, a piece of their emotional openness disappears. The problem is that many people mistake this patience for permanent tolerance. They begin believing the empath will always stay no matter how poorly they are treated. They assume forgiveness has no expiration date. They rely on the empath's loyalty while continuing behaviors that quietly damage the relationship. An empath notices everything, even when they say nothing. They notice changes in tone, inconsistency in effort, emotional coldness hidden behind polite words, and the subtle moments when they stop feeling emotionally safe around someone. While others may ignore these shifts, empaths absorb them deeply. The pain becomes heavier because they often feel emotions intensely. A careless sentence that someone else might forget in minutes can stay in an empath's mind for weeks. A moment of betrayal can echo in their heart long after the event has passed. Yet, despite this emotional intensity, they still keep trying to preserve the relationship. This is why an empath's departure often shocks people. From the outside, it appears sudden. One day they are present, supportive, and emotionally available. The next day they become distant, quiet, and emotionally unreachable. But the truth is that the empath started leaving emotionally long before they physically disappeared. Their silence did not begin overnight. It began in the moments when they felt emotionally abandoned while still standing beside someone. It began when their feelings were repeatedly minimized. It began when they realized they were carrying the emotional weight of the relationship alone. Unlike people who leave dramatically, empaths often withdraw in silence because they have already exhausted themselves trying to fix things. They reach a point where explaining their pain feels meaningless. They become tired of repeating what hurts them, tired of asking for the bare minimum, tired of hoping that empathy will eventually be reciprocated. And once they stop expressing disappointment, it usually means something serious has changed inside them. Their quietness is not peace. It is emotional detachment beginning to form. There is also a deep psychological reason why empaths disappear quietly. Most empaths avoid conflict because conflict drains them emotionally. They are highly affected by emotional chaos, tension, and negativity. So instead of creating dramatic endings, they often choose distance as a form of self protection. They slowly reduce communication. They stop sharing vulnerable parts of themselves. They begin guarding their energy instead of offering it freely. And while this process may appear calm on the surface, internally it is incredibly painful for them because empaths do not disconnect easily. An empath usually grieves the relationship long before leaving it. They mourn the version of the connection they once believed in. They replay memories of better moments and wonder how things became so emotionally empty. They continue hoping for change, even while recognizing patterns that keep hurting them. This inner conflict creates emotional exhaustion because part of them wants to hold on, while another part realizes staying is destroying their peace. What many people fail to understand is that empaths do not want perfection. They do not expect people to never make mistakes. They simply want emotional honesty, mutual care, and genuine effort. They can forgive flaws, but they struggle to survive emotional inconsistency. When someone repeatedly makes them feel emotionally unsafe, unseen, or emotionally disposable, the empath slowly begins shutting down internally. Their warmth becomes guarded. Their emotional energy becomes limited. Their trust becomes harder to access. One of the clearest signs an empath is reaching their limit is when they stop reacting emotionally. In the beginning, they may express hurt openly. They may try to communicate. They may fight for the relationship because they genuinely care. But once they become emotionally quiet, it often means they are no longer fighting to save the connection. They are observing it from a distance emotionally. And this emotional distance is difficult to reverse because empaths do not detach impulsively. By the time they stop caring visibly, they have already spent countless nights emotionally struggling in silence. People often regret losing an empath only after the empath disappears completely. That is because the empath's value becomes most visible in their absence. The emotional support they provided, the understanding they offered, the patience they carried, and the emotional safety they created suddenly become impossible to replace. Many individuals realize too late that the empath was the emotional foundation of the relationship. But by then, the empath has already chosen self preservation over emotional sacrifice. Once an empath reaches the point where protecting their inner peace becomes more important than preserving the connection, their departure becomes permanent. Not because they stopped loving deeply, but because they finally realized love should not require constant emotional suffering. They understand that compassion without reciprocity becomes self destruction. And when that realization fully settles into their heart, they stop chasing explanations, stop waiting for change, and quietly walk away while carrying the weight of everything they never said out loud. Empaths carry emotional memories differently from most people. While others may move past painful moments quickly or dismiss emotional experiences as temporary, an empath absorbs emotions deeply and stores them within their inner world for a very long time. They may smile, continue conversations, and act normal on the surface, but internally they rarely forget how someone made them feel. Their emotional memory is not just connected to words or actions, it is connected to energy, tone, atmosphere, and emotional intention. They remember the feeling behind the moment, and that feeling often stays with them long after everyone else has forgotten it. This emotional depth is what makes empaths both incredibly compassionate and incredibly vulnerable. Because they feel things intensely, they naturally form strong emotional connections with people. They pay attention to emotional details that others overlook. A change in someone's voice, a delayed response, a colder tone, or a lack of emotional presence can affect them more than people realize. They notice emotional inconsistencies immediately, even if they choose not to address them right away. And instead of reacting impulsively, empaths often sit with these emotions in silence, trying to understand what changed and why. An empath's first instinct is usually understanding rather than judgment. When someone hurts them, they do not immediately assume bad intentions. They try to see the pain, stress, or confusion behind the behavior. They ask themselves if the person is struggling emotionally. They wonder if something difficult is happening in their life. This ability to empathize with others is beautiful, but it also becomes dangerous when it causes them to excuse repeated emotional harm. Because the more they rationalize someone's behavior, the longer they remain in situations that quietly damage their emotional well being. What makes emotional wounds especially difficult for empaths is that they replay experiences internally over and over again. A careless comment may continue echoing in their mind for days. A betrayal may become something they analyze repeatedly in private. They revisit conversations, facial expressions, and emotional reactions trying to make sense of what happened. This constant emotional processing can become mentally exhausting because empaths do not simply experience pain once. They relive it internally many times while trying to emotionally resolve it. At the same time, many empaths become experts at hiding their emotional struggles. They do not always want to burden others with their pain. They fear being misunderstood or dismissed, so they continue showing kindness even while carrying emotional disappointment. They remain emotionally available even when their own emotional needs are neglected. This creates a painful imbalance where the empath becomes emotionally drained while others assume everything is fine. Because the empath rarely complains loudly, one of the deepest wounds an empath can experience is emotional neglect. Not because they demand constant attention, but because emotional connection is extremely important to them. They value sincerity, presence, and emotional reciprocity. When they feel emotionally ignored, dismissed, or emotionally unsafe, it creates a quiet sadness that slowly affects their spirit. And because they often continue giving love despite feeling hurt, people fail to recognize how deeply the empath is struggling internally. Manipulation affects empaths particularly strongly because empaths naturally trust emotional vulnerability. They tend to believe people's words when those words are expressed emotionally. They want to see the good in others. They want to believe people are capable of growth and honesty. But when someone repeatedly lies, manipulates emotions, or uses guilt to control them, the empath experiences more than disappointment. They experience emotional betrayal. And betrayal cuts deeply because empaths invest themselves emotionally in the people they care about. An empath also remembers patterns more than isolated incidents. It is rarely one mistake that pushes them away emotionally. It is the repeated cycle of feeling unappreciated, emotionally unheard, or emotionally used. Every time their feelings are minimized, a part of their trust weakens. Every time their vulnerability is mishandled, they become more emotionally guarded. The dangerous thing is that empaths often continue loving people while simultaneously losing trust in them. From the outside, the relationship may appear stable, but internally, the empath is slowly disconnecting emotionally. This emotional disconnection happens quietly because empaths rarely announce when their heart is breaking. Instead, they become more silent. They stop expressing certain emotions. They stop expecting understanding. They begin emotionally retreating into themselves because they no longer feel safe enough to remain fully open. Many people misinterpret this silence as calmness or maturity without realizing it is actually emotional exhaustion. An empath's emotional memory also affects the way they form future relationships. Once deeply hurt, they become more cautious about who they trust, not because they want to become cold, but because emotional pain leaves lasting imprints on them. They remember the moments they ignored their intuition. They remember the times they accepted less than they deserved in order to preserve a connection. They remember how emotionally draining it felt to constantly pour love into people who gave little in return. This is why empaths sometimes suddenly become distant after tolerating pain for a long time. What appears sudden to others is actually the final stage of a long emotional process. By the time the empath emotionally detaches, they have already spent countless moments wrestling with disappointment internally. They have already cried in silence, overthought conversations, questioned their worth, and tried to emotionally repair the connection within themselves. Their withdrawal is not impulsive. It is the result of accumulated emotional damage finally becoming too heavy to carry. Another reason emotional wounds stay with empaths is because they often connect deeply to people's emotional energy. They do not only hear words, they sense emotional intention. They can feel when affection becomes forced, when communication loses sincerity, or when someone's energy becomes emotionally distant. Even if nobody says anything directly, the empath feels the shift. And once they feel that emotional shift consistently, it becomes impossible for them to ignore it internally. Many empaths struggle with the conflict between their intuition and their compassion. Their intuition warns them when something feels emotionally unhealthy, but their compassion encourages them to keep understanding, forgiving, and hoping. This inner battle can continue for months or even years. Part of them recognizes the emotional imbalance clearly, while another part desperately wants the relationship to heal. This emotional conflict drains enormous mental and emotional energy. Eventually, however, there comes a point where the empath realizes that constantly carrying emotional pain for the sake of preserving a relationship is destroying their inner peace. They begin understanding that love without emotional safety becomes emotional suffering. They recognize that being compassionate does not mean tolerating repeated emotional harm. And once this realization fully settles into their mind, the empath begins emotionally letting go, even if they still care deeply inside. What makes this transformation so significant is that empaths do not stop loving easily. Their emotional attachment is genuine and deep. So when they finally become emotionally detached, it usually means they have reached the limit of what their heart can continue enduring. The person who once gave endless patience suddenly becomes emotionally unavailable. The person who once fought to keep the connection alive no longer has the emotional strength to keep sacrificing themselves. And the silence that follows often carries the weight of every emotion they suppressed. Every disappointment they endured and every wound they quietly carried alone. There comes a moment in an empath's life when survival becomes more important than attachment. For a long time, Empaths convince themselves that love means endurance. They believe loyalty means staying through pain, understanding people even when they are misunderstood in return, and continuing to give emotional energy no matter how drained they become. Because empaths naturally feel connected to the emotions of others, they often prioritize everyone else's healing while quietly neglecting their own. They become the safe place for people who never learn how to become safe for them. An empath usually enters relationships with genuine emotional openness. They do not love halfway. They invest deeply, listen carefully, and notice emotional details most people overlook. They remember the little things that matter to others. They try to make people feel emotionally seen, emotionally valued, and emotionally understood. This emotional depth creates powerful bonds, but it also creates emotional vulnerability because empaths often attach themselves to the emotional potential of a person rather than the reality of how they are being treated. For a long time, an empath may tolerate situations that slowly destroy their inner peace because they believe things can improve. They hold on to memories of how someone used to be. They focus on moments of kindness while minimizing patterns of emotional neglect. They keep hoping communication will improve, emotional effort will return, and the connection will eventually feel balanced again. Their compassion keeps them emotionally invested, even when their intuition quietly warns them that something is wrong. What many people fail to understand is that empaths do not leave quickly because emotional attachment is extremely meaningful to them. They value emotional connection deeply. They do not enjoy cutting people off or abandoning relationships. In fact, many empaths stay far longer than they should because they fear hurting others, even while they themselves are hurting. They continue carrying emotional burdens silently because they do not want to create conflict or emotional pain for anyone else. But the longer an empath sacrifices their own peace for the sake of preserving a toxic connection, the more emotionally exhausted they become. They begin waking up emotionally drained. Conversations that once felt comforting start feeling heavy. They notice themselves becoming anxious before interactions. They feel emotionally tense around people they once felt safe with. Slowly, their nervous system begins reacting to emotional inconsistency and emotional stress even before their conscious mind fully accepts what is happening. An empath's inner peace is deeply connected to emotional honesty and emotional safety. When they constantly experience manipulation, criticism, emotional coldness, or emotional unpredictability, their mind and body absorb that tension intensely because empaths are highly sensitive to emotional energy. Toxic environments affect them on a profound level. What others may dismiss as small emotional issues can feel overwhelming to an empath because they continuously process emotional undercurrents beneath the surface. Over time, the empath starts realizing something painful. They are fighting harder for the relationship than the other person is. They notice they are always the one trying to understand, trying to communicate gently, trying to repair emotional distance, and trying to preserve peace. Meanwhile, their own emotional needs remain ignored. This realization creates a deep inner conflict because empaths genuinely want relationships to survive, but they also begin recognizing the emotional cost of constantly abandoning themselves to keep others comfortable. One of the biggest turning points for an empath is when they understand that love should not require self destruction. For years, they may have confused sacrifice with loyalty. They believed enduring emotional pain proved the depth of their care. But eventually, emotional exhaustion forces them to confront the truth. Constantly shrinking themselves to maintain a relationship is not love. Constantly tolerating emotional harm in the name of understanding is not compassion. And constantly choosing others while neglecting their own well being slowly destroys their spirit. This realization does not come easily. In fact, it often comes after repeated heartbreak, sleepless nights, emotional confusion, and countless attempts to fix things. An empath usually reaches their breaking point quietly. There is rarely one dramatic event that changes everything instantly. Instead, it is the accumulation of emotional disappointment over time. It is the repeated feeling of being emotionally unseen. It is the exhaustion of giving love without receiving emotional security in return. Once an empath begins prioritizing their inner peace, their entire perspective changes. They start paying attention to how people make them feel emotionally instead of only focusing on understanding why people behave the way they do. They stop excusing harmful patterns simply because someone has pain or trauma. They realize that empathy should never become permission for mistreatment. This shift is powerful because empaths are naturally inclined to excuse behavior in order to preserve emotional connection. As they begin protecting their peace, empaths become more emotionally selective. They no longer give unlimited access to their energy. They stop over explaining themselves to people who consistently misunderstand them. They stop chasing emotional validation from individuals who only appreciate them when it benefits them. Their silence becomes intentional rather than fearful. Their distance becomes protective rather than passive. Many people become confused when an empath suddenly withdraws emotionally. They wonder why the empath became cold, distant, or unavailable after being so loving for so long. But what they fail to realize is that the empath did not suddenly stop caring. The empath simply became emotionally exhausted from caring without feeling emotionally safe in return. And once an empath associates a relationship with emotional pain more than emotional peace, their heart slowly begins detaching for survival. Choosing peace over attachment is not easy for an empath because their emotional bonds run deep. Even after deciding to leave emotionally unhealthy situations, they may still grieve intensely. They may miss the connection, the memories, or the potential they once believed in. They may question whether they gave up too soon, even after enduring years of emotional pain. This is because empaths naturally see the humanity in people. They remember good moments even while acknowledging harmful patterns. However, despite the pain of letting go, something inside the empath begins healing the moment they stop abandoning themselves for the sake of others. They begin rediscovering emotional calmness. The anxiety that constantly surrounded the relationship slowly fades. Their thoughts become clearer. Their emotional energy starts returning. They no longer feel responsible for fixing everyone else while ignoring their own emotional wounds. An empath who chooses peace becomes stronger in a completely different way. They stop confusing access with love. They realize not everyone deserves unlimited emotional closeness simply because they once cared deeply. They understand that protecting their energy is not selfish, it is necessary for emotional survival. This understanding transforms the empath because they begin recognizing their own emotional value instead of constantly proving it to others. Once this transformation happens, it becomes very difficult to pull the empath back into unhealthy emotional cycles, not because they no longer feel deeply, but because they finally understand the importance of emotional boundaries. They recognize the warning signs they once ignored. They trust their intuition more. They stop settling for emotionally inconsistent relationships simply because they fear losing connection. The quiet strength of an empath is often underestimated because their kindness makes people assume they will tolerate endless emotional pain. But when an empath finally chooses inner peace over emotional attachment, they become emotionally unreachable to the people who once drained them. The person who once stayed through everything suddenly walks away in silence, not out of hatred, but out of self preservation. And that silent departure often carries years of emotional exhaustion, suppressed pain, broken trust, and the painful realization that protecting their own soul had finally become more important than saving the relationship